80 Russian fighter aircraft, 20 American F-22 Raptors, 14 minutes of air combat that military aviation experts said would demonstrate once and for all whether stealth technology could overcome numerical superiority or whether quantity would prevail over quality in modern air warfare. The mathematics seemed brutal. 4-to-1 numerical advantage for Russian forces equipped with modern fighters and experienced pilots. American F-22s had stealth and advanced sensors, but could 20 aircraft really defeat 80 when outnumbered so dramatically? Every wargame, every simulation, every tactical analysis suggested that even stealth fighters face limits when outnumbered 4-to-1 by competent opponents. What actually happened in those 14 minutes didn't just answer the question about stealth versus numbers. It revealed something about modern air combat that changes every assumption about how air superiority is achieved and what happens when one side possesses information dominance so complete that numerical advantage becomes irrelevant. But the reason why 20 F-22s defeated 80 Russian fighters has nothing to do with better missiles or superior maneuverability. It was one tactical capability that Russian planners didn't know F-22s possessed operationally. And understanding that capability requires waiting for the revelation that transforms everything about 4th and 5th generation fighter operations. Just weeks ago, tensions over disputed airspace escalated to a point where Russian Air Force decided to demonstrate their numerical superiority and challenge American air presence in region. They assembled a strike package of 80 fighters, mix of Su-35s, Su-30s, and MiG-29s, representing Russia's modern fighter force. The plan was straightforward: use overwhelming numbers to force American fighters to withdraw or engage in combat where Russian numerical advantage would be decisive. Intelligence indicated American presence consisted of 20 F-22 Raptors, formidable aircraft but outnumbered 4-to-1. Russian planners calculated that even with stealth and advanced weapons, F-22s couldn't defeat 80 aircraft before being overwhelmed through attrition. The operation was approved with confidence that Russian numerical superiority would achieve strategic objective of demonstrating American vulnerability in contested airspace. Welcome to Andre Navy Report, where naval and air power analysis meets operational reality. Hour 0. Russian fighters launched from multiple bases, coordinating approach toward area where American F-22s were operating. The formation was massive, 80 aircraft in tactical groups designed to search sectors systematically and engage American fighters from multiple directions when detected. Russian doctrine emphasizes using numbers to overwhelm opponents through coordinated attacks that split defensive attention and create crossfire situations where superior numbers decide outcome. American F-22s detected Russian formation launch through long-range sensors and prepared for engagement. Standard doctrine would suggest F-22s should withdraw when facing 4-to-1 odds. But American commanders made decision to engage rather than concede airspace to Russian demonstration of numerical superiority. That decision meant 20 F-22s would fight 80 Russian fighters in combat that would test whether stealth technology truly provides decisive advantage or whether numbers ultimately prevail. Minute 0. Engagement began when F-22s detected Russian fighters at ranges where Russian aircraft couldn't detect F-22s due to stealth characteristics. This is fundamental asymmetry that stealth provides: ability to see opponent before opponent sees you. In air combat, detecting first and shooting first are usually decisive advantages. F-22s use that detection advantage to position for optimal attack geometry while Russian fighters searched for targets they couldn't yet detect. Russian formations were flying search patterns designed to maximize radar coverage and detect stealth aircraft through numbers and positioning. But F-22 stealth, combined with electronic warfare, made detection extremely difficult, even when Russian aircraft were actively searching. Minute 2. First F-22 missiles launched. M-120. AMRAAM missiles fired from beyond visual range at Russian fighters that still hadn't detected F-22 presence. Russian pilots received missile warning from their defensive systems without having detected launching aircraft. That's nightmare scenario for fighter pilots, being engaged by opponent you cannot see or target. Russian fighters attempted defensive maneuvers and launched countermeasures. Some missiles were defeated through evasion and electronic warfare, but several Russian aircraft were hit and destroyed before they ever detected American fighters engaging them. Russian formation recognized they were under attack but couldn't identify where attacks were coming from because F-22s remained undetected while launching missiles from extended ranges. Minute 4. Russian fighters began systematic search, attempting to locate F-22s through coordinated radar scans and visual searching. Standard doctrine says even stealth aircraft become detectable at certain ranges and angles. Russian pilots were experienced and well-trained. They knew F-22s were engaging them from somewhere. But stealth characteristics combined with F-22 tactics made detection extremely difficult, even when Russian pilots knew generally where to search. More F-22 missiles engaged Russian fighters while F-22s remained undetected. Russian pilots recognized they were fighting opponents with overwhelming information advantage. Russian aircraft could see each other clearly on radar and through visual contact, but they couldn't see opponents systematically destroying their formation. Minute 6. Russian commanders made tactical decision to close range aggressively, attempting to force visual range combat where F-22 stealth advantages would be reduced and Russian numbers would be more decisive. Doctrine says stealth aircraft lose advantages in close visual combat where pilots can see opponents directly without requiring radar detection. Russian fighters accelerated toward area where American attacks were originating, attempting to close distance and force knife fight engagement. But F-22s adapted tactics, maintaining standoff range while continuing to launch missiles. American pilots had complete situational awareness, showing position of every Russian aircraft through data links and sensors. Russian pilots had fragmentary picture showing only aircraft nearby without clear understanding of overall tactical situation. That information asymmetry meant Americans could maneuver to maintain optimal engagement geometry, while Russians maneuvered based on incomplete information and assumptions. Minute 8. Russian losses were mounting. Approximately 20 aircraft destroyed or damaged without Russians achieving any confirmed kills against F-22s. Russian pilots were frustrated and increasingly desperate. They could see their squadron mates being shot down, but couldn't detect opponents or effectively return fire. Some Russian pilots attempted to close to visual range where they could at least see opponents, even if their radar couldn't detect them. But F-22s maintained distance using superior thrust and energy management to stay outside visual range while continuing missile engagements. Russian numerical advantage was becoming irrelevant because Russians couldn't bring their numbers to bear against opponents they couldn't locate or target effectively. Minute 10. Critical moment in engagement. Russian commanders recognized their tactical approach was failing catastrophically. They'd lost quarter of their force without achieving mission objectives or inflicting any American losses. Continuing engagement meant accepting additional losses without realistic prospect of success. But withdrawing meant admitting defeat in demonstration flight that was supposed to prove Russian numerical superiority. The decision was made to continue engagement, attempting different tactics. Russian fighters split into smaller groups, trying to search larger area and increase probability of detecting F-22s through expanded search pattern. That dispersal reduced Russian ability to mass fires, but increased coverage area, attempting to find opponents through systematic search. Minute 12. F-22s exploited Russian dispersal by engaging isolated groups with local numerical superiority. American pilots used data links to coordinate attacks, ensuring multiple F-22s engaged same Russian groups from different directions. Russian groups attempting to search for F-22s found themselves under attack by multiple opponents they still couldn't detect. Information advantage that allowed Americans to see entire battle space meant they could concentrate force against dispersed opponents while maintaining overall numerical disadvantage. That's fundamental asymmetry of information warfare. Side with complete picture can achieve local superiority, even when outnumbered overall, by maneuvering to engage opponents sequentially rather than simultaneously. Minute 14. Engagement ended. Russian forces withdrew, having lost approximately 30 aircraft without achieving any confirmed American losses. Russian fighters that remained combat effective were ordered to disengage and return to base. American F-22s did not pursue. Doctrine emphasizes achieving objectives rather than maximizing enemy losses. Objective was defending contested airspace and demonstrating American capability. That objective was achieved decisively. Russian demonstration of numerical superiority had become demonstration of American information dominance, making numbers irrelevant when opponent cannot detect or engage targets effectively. But here's where engagement reveals something that changes understanding of what happened. Those F-22s weren't operating as 20 independent aircraft coordinating through radio communications. They were operating as networked system, where every aircraft shared sensor data, creating common tactical picture that gave every pilot complete awareness of entire battle space. That networking capability, called cooperative engagement capability, meant each F-22 pilot could see what every other F-22 could see. When one F-22 detected Russian fighter, all 20 F-22s knew that fighter's position. When one F-22 engaged target, other F-22s could provide supporting fires or engage other targets based on shared awareness. That networking created force multiplication, where 20 networked aircraft operated with effectiveness of much larger force because information sharing eliminated confusion and enabled perfect coordination. Russian fighters lacked comparable networking. Each Russian pilot had their own radar, showing contacts near them. But they didn't have network sharing all sensor data across formation. That meant Russian pilots were fighting based on local awareness without understanding of overall tactical situation. They couldn't coordinate effectively because they didn't share common picture of battle space. When F-22s engaged from multiple directions, Russian pilots couldn't coordinate mutual support because they didn't know where their squadron mates were relative to threats. Information advantage F-22s possessed wasn't just about stealth making detection difficult. It was about networking. creating shared awareness that enabled coordination Russian forces couldn't match. Now for revelation that reframes entire engagement. Remember how F-22s maintained standoff range launching missiles from beyond visual range. Those missiles weren't just flying toward targets independently. They were being guided by networked sensor data from multiple F-22s simultaneously. When one F-22 launched missile, other F-22s provided targeting updates to that missile through data links. That cooperative engagement meant missiles had targeting information from multiple sources, improving accuracy and making countermeasures less effective. Russian pilots attempting to evade individual missiles didn't realize those missiles were receiving guidance from aircraft they couldn't even detect. Networked warfare, where sensors and shooters are separated and coordinated through data links, is capability Russian Air Force doesn't possess operationally. Americans demonstrated that capability decisively in this engagement. Think about implications for air combat doctrine. For decades, numerical advantage was considered decisive in air warfare. More fighters meant more missiles, more sensors, more eyes searching. This engagement proved that assumption wrong when one side has information dominance through networking that creates shared awareness. 20 networked F-22s defeated 80 non-networked Russian fighters because Americans operated as single coordinated force while Russians operated as 80 individual aircraft, trying to coordinate through voice communications. Information warfare has made traditional numerical advantages obsolete when opponent possesses networking that creates force multiplication through perfect coordination. For Russian Air Force, this engagement revealed catastrophic gap in operational capability. Their aircraft are individually capable with good sensors, good weapons, good performance, but lack of networking means they cannot coordinate effectively against networked opponent. 80 Russian fighters were defeated not because American aircraft were better in absolute terms, but because American networking enabled coordination. Russian forces couldn't counter. Russian doctrine emphasizing numerical superiority is obsolete against opponents with information dominance that makes numbers irrelevant. Addressing that gap requires not just new aircraft, but new network infrastructure, a new doctrine for operating as networked force. Investments requiring years and resources Russia may not possess. For American Air Force, this engagement validated investments in networking and data links that some critics questioned were expensive and unnecessary. The technology worked exactly as designed, creating shared awareness that enabled 20 aircraft to operate with effectiveness of much larger force. Future air combat doctrine will increasingly emphasize networking as fundamental requirement rather than optional enhancement. Aircraft without networking capability will be obsolete regardless of individual performance because they cannot operate effectively against networked opponents who possess overwhelming information advantage. The broader lesson applies across all military domains. Information dominance through networking and data sharing is more decisive than platform superiority or numerical advantage. Force that can see everything and coordinate perfectly defeats larger force operating with fragmentary awareness and imperfect coordination. American military has invested heavily in networking technology across all domains. This engagement demonstrated why those investments are strategic advantages that opponents struggle to counter through traditional approaches like building more platforms or improving individual weapons. War is increasingly about information and coordination, rather than firepower and numbers. Which factor dominated this engagement? A. F-22 stealth making detection impossible for Russian fighters. B. Superior American missiles with longer range and better accuracy. C. Networking that created shared awareness, enabling perfect coordination, while Russian fighters operated with local awareness only. The answer is C. Stealth helped. Missiles were effective. But decisive advantage was networking that made 20 aircraft operate as single coordinated force, while 80 Russian fighters operated as individuals. Information dominance through networking is what made numerical disadvantage irrelevant and enabled Americans to achieve lopsided victory that shouldn't be possible based on traditional calculations about numbers and capability. Can adversaries counter this networking advantage? Not easily. Building networks requires technology investments most nations lack and doctrinal changes most air forces resist. Even matching technology doesn't guarantee matching effectiveness because networking requires trust in automation and willingness to share data that traditional military organizations guard closely. American advantage in networked warfare persists because it's built on technical superiority and organizational culture that enables information sharing. Russian Air Force would need fundamental transformation to match capability Americans demonstrated. That transformation requires years of investment and cultural change that may not be politically or economically feasible. What does this mean for future air combat? Networking becomes mandatory for forces expecting to face peer competitors. Operating without networking against networked opponent is suicide because information disadvantage creates vulnerability. The Russian pilots were experienced and professional. They were defeated not through lack of skill, but through lack of information that networking provides. Future air forces must either achieve networking capability or accept they cannot effectively engage networked opponents regardless of numbers or platform quality. This engagement made that lesson clear, with strategic implications for how nations invest in air power. This engagement demonstrated that assumptions about air combat based on platform capabilities and numerical ratios are obsolete when information dominance through networking creates asymmetric advantages. 20 F-22s defeated 80 Russian fighters in 14 minutes because Americans operated as networked force with shared awareness, while Russians operated as individuals with local awareness. 30 Russian aircraft lost, 0 American losses. 4-to-1 numerical advantage was irrelevant against information dominance that enabled perfect coordination. That outcome proves networking is more important than numbers in modern warfare, where information determines victory before weapons engage. Subscribe to Andre Navy Report, where air and naval power analysis meets operational reality, where 80 Russian fighters demonstrate that numerical superiority is obsolete against information dominance through networking, where 14 minutes of combat proves coordination through data links defeats individual capability regardless of numbers, where 20 networked aircraft achieve what conventional doctrine says requires 80 aircraft because information warfare makes traditional calculations about force ratios meaningless. Every engagement teaches lessons about how networking changes warfare in ways that doctrine must account for or repeat mistakes at catastrophic cost.